This is Eric Pepke for Dead Man Video. This video is called Grandfather Stories. It was inspired by a video by the Young Turks, commenting on a video by Ben Shapiro. And Ben Shapiro, of course, relies entirely on straw man arguments and rhetorical legerdemain, but he met his match in this particular video. They say it's been making the rounds, and of course, this guy actually used an effective communication with him, and then of course, Ben Shapiro accused him of doing all the things that Ben Shapiro actually does, but is skilled enough to keep rattling on so fast that nobody notices. Now, I like the Young Turks. Back before I was arrested, I used to watch them on the TV. And Jake in particular sometimes says, maybe not often enough, but more than a lot of people, some very perspicacious and insightful and incisive things. As to their politics, well, they're against the Republicans and the Democrats. That is what I call the Republicrats. And they think the mainstream press consists entirely of idiots, which is true. And they're poltroons as well. And you can look that word up. It's a great word. Everybody should use it. And they call themselves progressive. And I have a little bit of a problem with that, not because, well, a lot of people slam progressives because of straw men, but I think it's just sort of generally true that all coherent movements eventually become dominated by complete idiots, and nobody else gets a say. So I'm pretty allergic to all of those labels. Kurt Vonnegut once wrote that the fiduciary is impossible, what with the brain and the ding-dong. And the brain and the ding-dong interfere with a lot of stuff. And oh, by the way, you ladies, if you think you don't, you do. You just strap one on. Do I have to mention Margaret Thatcher and Sandra Day O'Connor and Madeleine Albright and Janet Reno and a whole bunch of other people, not to mention Susan Brown Miller and Marilyn French and Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon and that fine happy lot, and I'm sure you can name a few here. And this is unrelated to ideology. What happens is that many movements will start very good, they will have very good principles, and then they all go away. So I wouldn't call them progressives. And I think the only reason people still have some hope for progressives is that progressives don't have any power, and so nobody has experienced yet how awful they can be, at least in this country. They've ruined a few others. So it was a very interesting thing. And they talked about generational wealth, which is basically old money kept in families. And one of the analogies that the guy made to Ben Shapiro was Jews, which Ben Shapiro is nominally one, versus blacks. And of course, this didn't work on Shapiro or his supporters at all because their heads are full of squirrels. But never mind. And analogies are interesting because sometimes you have to get people out of their prejudicial comfort zone in order to say something. But when you make an analogy, there's always a way to misinterpret it, and people who are really resistant to paying attention, which is most of them, will simply choose the things that do not apply. So I immediately thought that there was a much better analogy, and that is Japanese Americans versus Chinese Americans. Now, Chinese Americans mostly came to this country to work at near slave wages on the railroads. I mean, that was the central thing. Of course, there were other Chinese that came over for other reasons. Japanese usually came over in the early days as voluntary settlers, and many of them were wealthy and meant affluent anyway. Certainly, Japanese are an industrious people. That is, the Japanese culture promotes the idea of hard work and success. And they used to have, Japanese had much, much higher social status than Chinese. Nobody remembers this, but back in the 19th century, on the left coast, racism was mostly against Chinese, and there are some really important Supreme Court cases with Chinese names. So the Japanese were more aristocratic, let's put it that way. Terrible word. Okay, they were more affluent. They were more like Europeans than the Chinese, even back then. And then, of course, what happened is that Roosevelt stole all their money and put them in what even he called concentration camps. And so, and of course, the Supreme Court thought this was the best thing they'd ever heard of doing, and locking up a bunch of nips. And Japanese culture in the United States and Japanese families have never recovered from that. They started off with a lot more money than Chinese on average or overall. But what do you see now? You see Chinatowns everywhere. Many of them are lavish and beautiful and wonderful. Are there Japantowns everywhere? I don't know. The only one I've ever seen was Little Tokyo in Los Angeles. I went to Los Angeles for a SIGGRAPH conference and stayed in a Japanese hotel because the conference hotels had already been booked solid. And it was really kind of great. One of the things I did is, from my window, I could see they just happened to have this Japanese cultural parade. And it was tiny. And they went basically once, and then they went around the block, and then they went through again. And it was fantastic. But very, very small. The other thing I did is I hung out in the karaoke bar, and it was a real karaoke bar. And one of my friends there, the guy I met and talked with, was actually Hawaiian, and so he was about the size of 3 Japanese people in all possible directions. And it was really nice because Japanese women would bring their voice teachers to hear them do karaoke, which I thought was charming. Now, I sang Mac the Knife in German. I figured that since they were allies during the war, they wouldn't mind that at all. And that got an interesting reaction. But, so yes, I think the Japanese are a pretty good analogy. But more important than generational wealth is what I call grandfather stories. And don't jump down on me. I mean, grandmother stories are important too, but they're different, and they're subject to different social forces. So grandfather stories are fairly obvious. Those are those things that your grandfather tells you if you're fortunate enough to have a grandfather. And since they made the analogy between Jews and blacks, I'll talk about myself. I'll say, am I a Jew or what? First of all, look at the schnoz. But second of all, I actually wasn't sure I was a Jew for quite some time. What happened was that my grandfather, on my mother's side, came to this country in 1929 from Germany. And it's very strange that when I say that, people say, well, why did he come over? I mean, it's not like Hitler was going to get the Jews then. Nobody knew that. And I think that just proves that my grandfather was a lot smarter than the people who asked me stupid questions like that. Admittedly, Hitler didn't get out until 1933. Not Hitler. Einstein didn't get out until 1933. But I believe Mein Kampf was 1923. I mean, was there anything unclear about Mein Kampf? Could you not figure out the people he didn't like? Is that really a problem? So when my grandfather came over, it was kind of, he was cautious, and it was ixnay on the uj ing thay. When people asked him why he evaded, why he got out of Germany, he said it was to escape the Catholic Church, which is oblique, but fair enough, especially considering who the greatest Catholic of them all was at the time. Although Hitler got mostly support from Protestants, he proudly said, I am and always have been a Catholic. Oh, by the way, he was never excommunicated. Some Catholics were excommunicated, but those were for things like marrying a Protestant, which of course is much more serious than slaughtering a whole bunch of people, including a whole bunch of Jews. So, never mind. So I was not really raised Jewish per se. I was steeped, saturated in Jewish culture. And I had the bris. And no, I'm not going to show you. Unless you are fat, female, and in your 40s or 50s, and then leave a comment, please. But my mother actually wasn't even sure that she was Jewish either. She grew up speaking Yiddish, which is very similar to Bavarian, but she thought, and then she forgot it, as many people do, but she thought that that was actually German, and although of course they're related, it's not quite the same. So I wasn't really raised as a Jew. I pretty much found out after my grandmother died, and we went to Bavaria, around Munich, Grassau, to sprinkle my grandmother's ashes. I went with my mother and my father, and I talked to people, and my father had done a lot of genealogical research, and yeah, I'm a Jew. I also met a guy called Onkel Vassel. I don't really know how to spell Vassel, but a rabbi who was named Yassel said how he spelled it, and I just replaced the Y with a W. And I always admired Onkel Vassel because back when things were happening that the rest of the world either liked or pretended weren't happening, Onkel Vassel went to a Biergarten and was bad-mouthing Hitler. Well, that night, they got a knock on the door at 4 a.m. and some people came in looking for documents and slitting open the pillows and stuff like that. And he wasn't sent to a camp because Hitler was still more concerned with how easy it was to kill Polish Jews, and that he hadn't run out yet. And he was in Germany, and so instead he just got drafted into the army, which he survived. So I'm actually not the first member of my family to face political imprisonment. And I always kind of admired him. And I would tell the story. And I was telling it to some woman, and she said, "Boy, he was stupid." And I came to realize that this is how Americans think. And they do have a point, because Americans, especially now, will not make waves because they think that's smart and it's safe. But all it does is allow fascism to flourish. And eventually, as Martin Niemöller said, first they came for the socialists, and I didn't stand up because I wasn't a socialist, etc. And then they came for me, and when they came for me, There was nobody left to stand up. That is what happens to, I don't know if it's all civilizations or most civilizations or all civilizations eventually. But again, what with the brain and the ding-dong, it seems to happen rather a lot. So, where was I going with this? All right, so he was ixnay on the UJ thing, and so I didn't know for certain whether I was a Jew, although it was always in my whatever. After I realized this, I studied more. I already knew a lot of Jewish culture, but especially in prison, I studied a lot. Now, before I was in prison, I did get a naming ceremony, and my name is Jakob. And that is the guy who beat up the angel until God had to kick him in the nuts to get him to stop. And that's kind of like me, except I don't think even getting kicked in the nuts has stopped me, at least not yet. But I got the grandfather stories from my grandfather. And one of them was this. He came to this country, and in Germany at the time, you just couldn't get a job. He said, well, America was great because you could get a job. You might have to travel for 300 miles to get a job, but you can get a job. Now, I personally have traveled well over 300 miles to get a job, which just shows you about comparative economies. And I thought that was a fantastic piece of advice. He said, it really only takes 2 weeks to become an expert at any job. And I also apply that to any philosophy or academic discipline. As long as it's broken up small enough, you can really learn a lot in a couple of weeks. And that has been one of the main guiding principles of my life. Now, Black Americans, the family was disrupted, first by the practice of breeding chattel slaves like chattel, which means cattle. And then you had, as still going on, imprisonment to keep, not only to keep black men from voting, but to keep them out of the lives of their family. You have the plurality black family in the U.S., which is sort of similar to some practices in Africa, but not really very much because it's been so disrupted and it's no longer organic. And it's what I call the strict grandmother model. And so the grandmother has to act kind of in loco parentis. And so it disrupts the grandmother stories too, but it certainly disrupts the grandfather stories. And this is one of the reasons Jews tell all these stories, is to keep the grandfather stories alive, to keep that kind of wisdom alive. And of course it's sometimes fusty and old-fashioned, but it still holds the people together over time, which is extremely important. This is something that has been systematically denied to black people. And oh yes, during the Jim Crow era, there were actually fairly functional black institutions and even a system of black banks. I have some photos from the 30s, and all the people very proudly dressed up. It looks exactly like a white bank, and you can see the same emotions on the faces of the people, except it's smaller. And this is something consistently denied by the right. They say, oh yeah, slavery's over, Jim Crow's over, get over it. But when you're talking about a people, not just an individual, this stuff takes centuries. It certainly takes generations. You have the Japanese in America who still have not recovered. As a people, as individuals, they're doing pretty okay. But as a people, Japanese Americans have not recovered for something that happened 80 years ago. That's a very sad thing. I don't have any solutions, and I don't really know what I could say about it, so I'll just stop now and go back to drinking homemade cider. So, have a nice day.